Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Jerry Wooten. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and thank you for having me here tonight on the Civil War Congress. I am presenting to you tonight the story about Johnsonville, Tennessee, one of the probably one of the most unheard of stories of the Civil War, especially in the Western Theater. I'll be giving a lot of geographical reference throughout my presentation tonight, so you'll know exactly where I'm talking about since all of you are students of the American Civil War. So I'm just going to dive right into it, and you can see there on my front slide that is also the title of my book, and at the end of the presentation you'll have some information on how to order the book, and my publisher is Savas Beatty, and for Christmas they're actually offering a 20% discount. It's the best discount I've seen since we've started. So you'll have a chance to look at that when we're done. But before we get there, let me get you into the story first and give you a little bit of tidbits about some of my research and what I uncovered on this incredible story called Johnsonville. So just going to get into this: Union supply operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, which took place late in the war in November of 1864. Really what Johnsonville was simply a quick fix for the Union Army late in the Civil War. Began really in August of 1863. It eventually ended up being the largest supply operation ever built on the Tennessee River in Tennessee during the Civil War. Essentially, where to begin? It's a very long, convoluted story, and I've put this together, I think, in a very concise PowerPoint as best as I can tell this story. But if you know how the war in the West developed, you'll know very quickly that after the fall of Fort Donelson, Tennessee in February of 1862, federal forces thus occupied Nashville in late February. So, Fort Donelson surrenders on February the 16th. And by the 25th of February, Union forces have captured the capital in Tennessee, actually the first capital captured in the South. So President Lincoln very quickly knows that there's going to be resistance. So very shrewdly, he appoints staunch Tennessee Unionist Andrew Johnson as a military governor of Tennessee as early as March 3rd, 1862. Now, Lincoln had tried this in Louisiana. It failed. So his second attempt would be appointing a military governor. So, you're all familiar, everybody has a governor of a state, but a military governor would still serve that purpose, but also be over all the military actions and operations in the state. Something I found in the research that was very interesting about that rank or that position is that it did hold a rank of a brigadier general, but it was still outranked by General Rosecrans, who was a major general. So Rosecrans, who of course was the highest ranking general operating in Tennessee at that time, actually outranked the military governor, Andrew Johnson. So it was still military protocol that was followed. And as they moved into early March, Tennessee had a military governor. So Johnsonville, the word Johnsonville has everything to do with Andrew Johnson because half of it is its name. And I'll explain to you why coming up here. I've got some great photographs here of Nashville and Tennessee during the war. It's happening around this time. What you're looking at here is the railroad depot just below the state capitol. Tennessee has the third oldest state capitol still in the Union today. And you can see it there in the background, finished by famed architect William Strickland, who designed many buildings, most famously the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. If you've been there and have seen that beautiful building, you can see that the cupola on the state capitol is almost identical to that building. But anyway, Strickland finished this state house in 1859, just 2 years right as the secession crisis was going on. And you can see it's such a majestic building. I actually work, I manage this property. I actually work and manage the grounds of Tennessee State Capitol. It's called Bicentennial Mall today because the park that surrounds it was dedicated on Tennessee's bicentennial in 1996. but the building still stands. Unfortunately, the buildings you see around the Capitol are no longer there. This is the famous Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad Depot that sat just below the bottom of the hill there. And you can see the types of trains that would have regularly been running to Johnsonville. So then, I'm going to answer some basic questions. What is the place and why was it needed? As I told you before, it's named after Andrew Johnson, and it was a supply depot. But in 1862, July, that summer, Union commanders really feared that the Cumberland River could quite possibly be too shallow to handle these deep draft supply vessels that regularly docked at the wharf. So the reason being is that summer, there was a tremendous drought in the South, and Tennessee did not escape that drought. So the Cumberland River actually got down to record lows. So that's, it was a remarkable thing. Here they are, they captured this city that was one of the largest railroad hubs except for Atlanta in the South, that they had to look at possibly abandoning because they feared that they could not use the wharf, the massive wharf at Nashville, for supplies and loading and receiving troops and everything that they needed to move south. So that was a consideration. To give you an idea what that looked like, this is actually First Avenue in Nashville in about 1875, about 10 years after the war. It didn't change too much. I have a feeling this is probably in 1864. This is what it still looked like. The buildings that you see to the left are still intact. They're still there today. That's Front Street. The river is the Cumberland River. So we have really, three major tributaries in Tennessee. You have the Mississippi River that borders the western part of the state. And then you have the Tennessee River that loops around through the state like a horseshoe. And a tributary that flows into that is the Cumberland River. So the Cumberland River is the river that basically picks up at Paducah, Kentucky, and winds its way into Tennessee. So that's what you're looking at here. And you're looking at a lot of you can see some of those deep draft vessels that you see here. A lot of these are transport boats. And you see the wharf and you see a lot of supplies. So that would have been a common scene in 1864. And you can see that this activity is still going on 10 years later. So essentially, Johnson decided with his Union commanders that since they may not be able to use the Cumberland River as a base for to resolve their supply issue, they would have to look at an alternative to this. And that would mean moving a railroad line west of Nashville to connect to the deeper channeled Tennessee River. So from the base of Nashville to the Tennessee River is exactly 78 miles. So the site that they eventually chose was a existing riverboat landing along the Tennessee River called Lucas Landing. It's in Humphreys County, Tennessee. And I'm going to show you the state. Here's Tennessee. And in red there, you see where Humphreys County is. So if you just go to your right, 2 counties over, that's Davidson County where Nashville is located. So from Davidson County all the way to the Tennessee River, that 78 miles of railroad track would have to be constructed. So this was a major engineering marvel undertaking, especially here at the late stages of the war, as Union federal forces are moving rapidly into the South. So this was all on the backs, in the hands of Andrew Johnson as military governor to make sure that this railroad would succeed. So if you're following me up to this point, there's a need for a supply depot. It needs to be built on the Tennessee River. They've got to abandon that idea of using Nashville and construct a railroad to connect the Tennessee River to Nashville in basically less than a year. This is a really great photograph that came into my hands. I believe I used this in the book. If I did not, this came to me. But this shows Johnsonville at Lucas Landing. This was taken about 1918, and it still shows the unflooded Tennessee River. The Tennessee River was eventually flooded by the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1944 to form the Kentucky Lake, Kentucky Reservoir. But this shows the unflooded Tennessee, and you can see that it's about 350 yards across. And that wood line that you see on the other side is eventually where the Confederates under Nathan Bedford Forrest would set up in early November 1864 and and attack the supply depot. The worst, whoever took this photograph is standing on the site of Johnsonville. I saw this and about melted. This was a really, really rare, fantastic photograph that came to existence to make this happen. So as the war progressed, the Battle of Stones River takes place in Tullahoma in that summer. So you get to August of 1863. So the Army, which is under the authority of Governor Johnson, begins construction of a military railroad to the Tennessee River. The construction of the railroad falls under the responsibility of this gentleman right here, Colonel William Ennis. He's actually the commander of the U.S. Military Railroad Department in Tennessee. So Johnson actually orders him to oversee completion of what eventually becomes known as the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. Now, just so you'll know, the railroad had actually started construction back in the 1850s, and it had stopped in about 1859 due to financial reasons. So it sat dormant for about 5 years until this project picked back up. So from Nashville to a town just outside of Nashville, about 28 miles, called Kingston Springs, there had been 28 miles of track laid from the center of Nashville to this place. So the challenge by Ennis was to finish the construction of the railroad 50 more miles to the Tennessee River and have this completed within 6 months. I try to wrap my mind around that. Today we have, backhoes and steam shovels and bulldozers, but, keep in mind, I mean, this is pickaxes and dirt sleds and horses that are moving this dirt and building this railroad bed. Eventually, Ennis is called off of the line because to oversee actions further south along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad as the Army progressed toward Chattanooga later that fall. And the responsibility of completing the railroad falls into the hands of General Daniel McCallum, who U.S. Grant had actually known in Ohio and brought him to finish the project for the military railroad. So the big mystery, and that's one of the big parts of this story too, is where the labor was going to come from. Because keep in mind, the federal forces are moving very rapidly south at this stage in the war. So the manpower that's needed to fight the war is being used on the front lines. So the availability of the manpower that's behind the front lines basically falls upon the shoulders of black men and some women in the local communities that had been freed by federal forces when they came into Tennessee. So you have all these freed black men that are really impressed. And, the term impressment is a naval term, where in London, if you've read those stories, they went into the towns, these seacoastal towns, and would impress men to serve on ships. Well, impressment is still being used. It really is it picks back up in the American Civil War, and the term impressment is used quite frequently. Looking at a lot of the correspondence of Andrew Johnson and the Union commanders that are attempting to do this, and they go into these small Tennessee towns, really the ones surrounding Nashville, on Sunday mornings during church services, and they walk right into these churches and say, "Hey, we need all able-bodied black men." Excuse the grandfather clock over here. My grandfather was a grandfather clockmaker, so that's what you're hearing in the background. And they would actually impress these men into service, walk them in labor contingents into Nashville, and form them into really labor battalions, and begin forcing them to work on this railroad. And this was another great photograph I located. This is a picture of an impressed black laborer. So around 7,300, at least from my research, I discovered probably 73 to 7,500 impressed free blacks were used as labor to finish the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad for about a year, from August of 63 to September of 1864. And what's really interesting about this, look what he's wearing. He's wearing a 4-button Federal sack coat. So they're being supplied and they're being fed by the Union Army a lot of them wearing those kind of clothes. But you see, it's hard to tell from black and white photographs if those are the sky blue trousers or not. But I was very impressed to find this photograph. It's quite revealing. And most of you have seen this. This is supposedly taken in Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 1863. This is impressed black laborers working on some line. Of course, it's a staged photograph. They're holding pickaxes while the image is being made. But I show this because this would have been very representative of how the railroad was being constructed to Johnsonville. The famous first Michigan engineers had been brought in even earlier than that in February of 1863 and had been ordered to begin really laying out plans even before this even started in September of 1863. So the completion of the railroad today, I think, still remains as one of the greatest accomplishments of military engineering in the entire Civil War. Located this in our state archives. I think this is a fantastic hand-drawn map by a federal officer. If you look up where you see Nashville, if you look to the left, you see right there Nashville and Northwestern, and he writes in fair condition. And you see down there below the line, 78 miles in possession, and it gives the date of when it becomes in possession. But it also shows the other main lines being used by the Federal Army in March of 1865. You got the Nashville and Chattanooga, and directly south, the Tennessee and Alabama Railroad. All through the war, Nathan Bedford Forrest, operating in the vicinity, especially of West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee, would wreak havoc on all of these railroads, and the Nashville and Northwestern was no exception. This is a photograph taken in Virginia. It's not Tennessee, but it's the one that I found that I wanted to show because it gives you a really good idea of probably what it looked like when they cut this railroad out of the woods. And believe me, it was thick forest from Nashville to the Tennessee River. And the railroad itself is only 11 feet wide. So you've got a 10-foot, 9 to 10-foot wide rail car basically on a frame, on a wheeled frame. And this is what you would have seen. You would have seen a very raw appearance of of railroad ties that were cut straight out of the woods. They would have been built right on site, and they would have laid the track until they got there, having to build the bed up as they went. This is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Wharton's map of the vicinity. It's a very long map, but I'm just showing you. You see the Tennessee River to the left. If you'll look there, you see Johnsonville toward the bottom where you see the red line. Just above that, about 2 miles, is an existing town, one of Tennessee's earliest towns called Reynoldsburg. Eventually, the railroad was going to go to Reynoldsburg because there was some existence of a town and a courthouse there. But due to the geography of the Tennessee River, they decided on going to Lucas Landing that eventually became Johnsonville, because if you'll see right there, you've got a pretty straight stretch to where you can see up and down the river about 2 miles north or 2 miles south. So this is where they would eventually build their supply depot beginning in August of 1863. And I go into quite a bit of detail about this in the book, so I'll hope you enjoy that part. And I also go in a lot about some of the information I just talked about with the building of the railroad. So the first 3 chapters really, I think, do a good job of that. So to kind of move things forward, Andrew Johnson and a party of civilian officers arrived from Nashville by train on the newly built railroad in May of 1864, May 19th to be specific. So 9 months later, they've got a railroad available for travel. So with his party of officers, he comes down to Johnsonville. They have a cold collation of sandwiches and cigars and brandy in the back of a caboose. And supposedly, there's not really any accounts in the ORs that I found of this, but I did find 2 really good accounts, folklore accounts of Johnson stepping out on the back of a caboose. And somehow, one of the workers probably at the depot hands him a bottle of wine, and he stepped down off the steps of the caboose, and there happened to be a pile of railroad ties just sitting off next to the railroad track, and he jumped on top of the railroad ties, and he held the wine bottle over his head, and he smashed it over the rails, and he says, "I hereby declare this place Johnsonville." So the name stuck, and it stayed that way to today, except the day's name is New Johnsonville, and I'll explain that toward the end of the story. But I've always thought how fun it would be just to pay for your own place that you had built, and then you go down there with all your parts and you name the place after yourself. I've always thought that's kind of a fun treat. So this is a bird's eye view of what the depot eventually looked like, made by my friend and artist David Meager. He actually drew this almost 30 years ago in 1992. This is a huge poster. I was able to reduce it down. That's why it's a little bit difficult to see. But what David did was take the only known photographs that exist of Johnsonville during the war and compile this bird's eye view, which I think he did a marvelous job capturing what Johnsonville most likely looked like. And you can see the vessels that are docked at the wharf. You see the two big supply warehouses toward the end, and I'll get into that in just a minute. It was protected by two forts. You see up there on top of the hill was a redoubt, and there was a second redoubt on a higher hill about 350 yards above that. Johnsonville is a very hilly area right on the bank of the Tennessee River. For those of you who've never been to Middle Tennessee, our topography in Tennessee, basically, if you follow it from the west from the Mississippi River, it's quite flat. As you cross the Tennessee River in the Middle Tennessee, it becomes very hilly. And then, of course, as you get past Knoxville over into the eastern part of the state, that's where the Smoky Mountains are, and it's very mountainous. So our topography in the state is very representative of what David Meager has drawn here. So and I told you in the beginning, this is kind of a convoluted story, but the U.S. Quartermaster's Department actually ran the supply operation and operated the wharf at Johnsonville. So you have the U.S. Army, you have the U.S. Navy operating here, but you have the United States Quartermaster's Department under, Major General Montgomery Meigs, who's operating this whole system here. It's under his system of quartermaster depots dotted all over the South at this point in the war. This is another great photograph I found in our archives. This is the Nashville's Taylor Depot. This is the clothing depot. And for those of you who've been to Nashville as a visitor, if you've been there and you have had a chance to visit the Country Music Hall of Fame, if you've been to the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum, it sits on the exact spot of where this depot building sat in 1864. And if you look up in the background, you see the state capitol just at the end. And you also see the Episcopal Church steeples off to the right, just behind the roof line. But it was a massive depot building. There was a number of depot buildings that made up the Nashville depot. So just to kind of put this together, you've got the massive Nashville depot that is a conglomeration of many buildings like this photograph, and a subsidiary to the Nashville depot is Johnsonville. So surrounding Nashville, you had all these towns like Gallatin, Tennessee, Hendersonville, Clarksville. You go down to the border of Athens, Alabama, Johnsonville. So you have this circle of towns where there's smaller supply depots located. And the picture that I'm trying to paint for you here is that, it's late in the war. And when I give this presentation to Civil War roundtables around the country, I try to really make a point that, by this stage in 1864, late fall of 1864, the Union war machine has finally kicked in, and it is a massive machine. You got to think the Confederacy at this time, they were losing the war, and they were losing badly because of operations just like this. There's no way that they could produce even a quarter of the amount of supplies that was being produced out of the great Nashville depot, is what you see right here. So that's what's eventually is going to be happening at Johnsonville. Here is a wharf. This is taken in Chattanooga, but since there's not a photograph that exists of Johnsonville's wharf, this probably gives you a good idea on any given day of what the transport boats that delivered supplies looked like as they came from northern destination points places like Cincinnati, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri. They would eventually make their way using these transport boats, hauling much needed supplies to Johnsonville. Now, over the Nashville depot was this man, Colonel James Donaldson. He was actually a West Point classmate of Montgomery Meigs, and Meigs actually gave him the command of the Nashville depot in 1862. So he had been in charge of this for almost 2 years. So he oversaw the overall operation at Johnsonville. This man, who was Assistant Quartermaster Henry Howland, and I won't go in a whole lot of how the ranking of the quartermaster's department took place, but if you had acting assistant quartermasters, you had assistant quartermasters, and an assistant quartermaster was usually a presidential appointment with the rank of captain. So Henry Howland, who replaced the original quartermaster at Johnsonville, would be overseeing the operation on site at Johnsonville when the battle would take place. I'm just going to show you a few things, articles that were common that would come through these depots. You had uniforms for the troops. You had field accoutrements, haversacks and canteens, muskets, priming caps, blankets, crates and crates of hardtack. I put this in here because this is taken at City Point, Virginia, another massive supply operation in Virginia. But this would have been a common scene at Johnsonville as well, just stacks and stacks of crates that held hardtack and a lot of supplies, a lot of food supplies. This is a wartime era photograph. You see the circumference of the inside of the depot. Now, just to give you a little description, the Federal Army, when they got to Lucas Landing, they cut out a 90-acre semicircle perimeter that made the supply depots. And then within the supply depot, they started building things such as loading ramps, administrative buildings, and then the two massive supply transfer warehouses that I'll show you in just a minute. Here specifically, you see Lower Fort and Upper Fort. The distance between the two, you see the earthworks that are still there. Prior to my tenure in my current position at the state capitol, I was manager at Johnsonville for 6 years. And I'll have to say, I've worked in Virginia. I was historian at Pamplin Park in Petersburg. I've been around those earthworks. I can tell you this, I've never quite seen a more impressive preservation of earthworks after 150 years of erosion than what exists of the earthworks at Johnsonville, Tennessee. There's nothing like it. They basically have been sitting out in these woods for 150 years undisturbed. So that line of rifle pits that you see between the lower fort and the upper fort, and I'm sorry on the PowerPoint, I can't use my laser pointer. But you can see this was, they were preparing eventually for an attack that would come. And the attack that they were preparing for, of course, would be from a land attack. And unbeknownst to the green Union officers that were in charge of the place, they had no idea what would be coming their way on November 4th, 1864. This is just some sketches, again, by artist David Meager of the two forts. You see the smaller lower redoubt to the left and the upper redoubt on the right. Those redoubts are massive. They still stand today. If you go visit Johnsonville when you're in Tennessee, you can walk straight out in the woods and see these exact outlines. Now, we're very fortunate, and this really changed the course of my research, in having 5 existing photographs. And if all of you are Civil War historians, you know how rare it is to have photographs taken in the Western theater. So Jacob Coonley, who basically was a protege of many other photographers, but specifically George Bernard. And George Bernard was the photographer that took those famous photos in Atlanta and all those around Nashville's capital in 1864. Working for Bernard, he was assigned to travel on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, photographing that line. He got to Johnsonville and took a series of photographs, and what I'm about to show you are those 5 photographs with and a repeat photograph of what they look like today. So we're incredibly lucky to have these 5 photographs. But Jacob Coonley was the photographer, and I went to the Library of Congress and I looked at the original photographs, and they're quite impressive. And I know that he took more than 5, but in the history of, like most Civil War photography, the plates, I'm sure, either were destroyed or they've ended up in someone's private collection that they do not know what they have. So here are the 5. This was the first photograph that he took. He set his tripod up on the center railroad line and turned it back toward the redoubt and snapped this shot. If you look just above the barracks building in the center of the photograph, you'll see a man standing on the wall of the redoubt. That is an African American soldier in a poncho. Thank God for digital photography. You can really zoom these things in today. And we found in doing so that the barracks building there on the hillside in the middle actually has what's called loopholes. And loopholes are where men could stick their rifle through the loophole, close the shutters. So in case they were attacked by the land side, they could get in these barricades. And that's why they're on barren ground, high up in the middle of a hillside. What you're looking at below there are administrative buildings. If you go to Johnsonville today, this is exactly what it looks like. So I'll go back one. So if you see the terrain in the middle, and I took this photograph in the summer, you can see the hillside where the two buildings in the middle of the photograph sit. Once again, if you go forward, there's that same hillside. And you're looking at the base today just without those buildings. The road in the foreground here is the same road where you see the wagon wheel. If you look just in front of that, there's a road. That's this road in the foreground that I'm standing on taking the photograph. The second photograph is the only known existing photograph of the actual town of Johnsonville. So Johnsonville was became a town that built up around this depot. So much like, we have Fort Campbell, Kentucky, right here at Clarksville, Tennessee, that's a military operation built just on the outskirts of a civilian town. Well, 150 years ago, the same thing is happening here. You have a civilian town, which you see in the background, built up right on the border of the depot. And what you're looking at here, if you look in the foreground, you see a hill that's going up. Coonley set his tripod there and shot the center rail line and some loading platforms. I love this photo because if you look at the trees, it shows the charred trees from the Battle of Johnsonville, the fires that had swept through there. You can see a lot of the trees have been burned. I think this is just a remarkable photograph. When you enhance this digitally, you can see these little black dots that are down there right in the middle of the railroad track. Those are actually shoes. Those are brogans that have been dropped off of a supply car. That's what it looks like today. This is that same location. So where you see the platform in this, the loading platform, the ramps, that's where you see right here, still low area. In the background, that's the flooded Trace Creek. So that's not the actual Tennessee River channel. I'll show you that in just a minute. So if you see the word Johnsonville there, if you look just below that, you'll see a little protrusion that sticks out. That's that loading ramp that you see right here. This is an engineer's map drawn in 1865, and you see the double center rail. Coonley is standing on the one that's lower to the bottom of this map. The third photograph was the massive double-roofed supply transfer warehouse. I think this is just a fantastic photograph. It shows the rawness of a supply operation behind the lines, what's going on. But if you look at this for a minute, you can see a lot of things. You see the stacks of wheelbarrows underneath the roof line. The blanket that I showed you earlier when I was showing you pictures of supplies that were common. If you look in there, if you enhance this photo digitally, you can see stacks and stacks of blankets. A lot of the men up there near the building are wearing sack coats. You see the gentlemen in overcoats standing up here on the front of the loading platform. And again, this is just a jewel of a photograph. You can see that the building is standing elevated Um, Basically, they built this because of the high flood waters from the Tennessee River in the springtime. And as you move forward, that's what this looks like today. This is actually in the park today. So the where you see the cannon in the photograph, the area that's flooded there from what is now the flooded Tennessee River, it's only about 3 feet deep. So where you see the word today, right at the bottom of the D, back toward the cannon, that's only about 3 feet deep. So those warehouses sat. This is where the double roof warehouse sat. And if you look at the pretty orange trees on your right, that's what's left of the center railroad line. And then on the opposite side of that was warehouse number one. And across the river, of course, is where the Confederates under Nathan Bedford Forrest would attack the depot. If you look at the word today, you see where the TO is on today. You'll see an island out in the middle of the Tennessee River. That is what's remaining of the western river shore. And that is one of the gun positions where Forrest would eventually set up his artillery. So you can see that they were quite close. I just absolutely love this photograph. Coonley completely turned his tripod back toward the fort and he snapped this shot, which gives a really good panoramic scale of Johnsonville. And as I showed you the bird's eye view drawing that David did in 1992, you can kind of see now how he's piecing this together. Um, in my research, I blew these photographs up so much that I came up with an actual number. I figured that the depot had 192 buildings exactly. So it was a pretty substantially sized operation right there on the banks of the Tennessee River. But what's very interesting about this is that you don't see any tree standing, and the shed that you see in the foreground, right in the middle of the photograph, is what's called sawmill number one, and that was probably the first structure built at Johnsonville. Eventually, it would produce over 488,000 square board feet of lumber that would have been used to build these buildings that you see, and specifically the railroad ties that would have been used to construct the railroad that you see here in the foreground. Um, Today, you can still see that railroad. There's just an enhancement of the sawmill. You can also see the hillside very well there. You see the soldier standing in the poncho. You see the felled timber that's lying. It's a very steep hill. When you go there, you'll see what I'm talking about. But today, there's some more details of the water. You can see a lot of the coals that were just left. I took a winter shot. This is what it looks like today. So where I'm standing, I feel that's basically right where that photo right here is taken. And I wanted to take this in the winter to give visitors, viewers, a sense of the terrain. You can see it's very heavily wooded still today, and that was a cold, icy February day about 4 years ago. And of course, what became the dust jacket cover of my book is one of the most iconic photographs of the American Civil War. If you've looked at any Civil War book of the Western Theater, you have seen this. Um, this is the second U.S. light colored artillery. Um, you can see that their horses have been everything they've been dislimbered, and they have in the background. If you look way in the back, you'll see a corral. It's a 6-acre corral. So all the horse tack, have been thrown up on the limbers. I think this is just a fantastic photo. If you look at how it's positioned, if you look off to the left, you'll see the rail cars, and just behind the rail cars is the Tennessee River. You see the fog coming up from the Tennessee River. If you look all the way in the background to the wood line, that's where Trace Creek runs into that. So it gives you a really good scope of the landing. The length of the wharf was 600 yards long here. So take 6 football fields and line them up. This was a massive wharf. And when you're standing here today, now it's a wooded, forested park, but you can still stand up at the upper fort and look up the Tennessee River. And when you say look up, you're actually looking down. So in naval terminology, as you're looking down in this direction, you're looking down the Tennessee River. So north is down. And so Paducah, Kentucky would be in this direction. So the loading platform here, you can look, they're all African-American troops. There's one white officer, if you've seen that movie Glory, this is exactly what's going on here. You see the one white officer, young officer in the middle. Um, if you do get a chance to look at this on the Library of Congress's page, and these are actual photographs which you can really enhance digitally. If you'll look at that gentleman, he's looking right at the camera. He's a young man. He's got, he's got his officer scales on there. And if you look off to the left, you see a McClellan saddle that's sitting there on the loading ramp. But there's a lot of great things in this photo if you get a chance, more of a chance to enhance that. And this is what that area looks like today. You can still see the railroad spur. I took that photo in 2016. It's amazing. It's just like if there's, I've pretty much, probably like most of you, have visited every Civil War site in America. I don't think I've ever quite seen anything like this. The the Civil War railroad ties, the railroad bed, are still there. They run right into the lake. It's like they just closed the depot 150 years ago and left, and it's still there. It was still being used after the war until the town was eventually abandoned due to the Great Depression. So you can go there today and still walk the original railroad. That is the scene. If you see the gentleman in the foreground with the overcoat on, that's where the location of this photograph is taken today. And you're looking out across the Tennessee River at where Pilot Knob sits today, which is another Tennessee state park called Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park. This is an aerial view of Johnsonville taken in 1939. It gives a really good idea of the scale, the length of the Tennessee River. And you can see the Civil War era spurs that were still being used. Now, the town eventually grew up after the Civil War, and that's what you're looking at here. There's also a blockhouse at Johnsonville. We do not have a photograph that was taken of that. This is one in Chattanooga, but I've seen the engineered drawings of the Johnsonville blockhouse, and this is what it looked like. This is the location of where the blockhouse sat today in Johnsonville. If you look down at the base of that hill, you'll see a trail. That is the railroad line. That is the spur of the railroad that, as you enter Johnsonville, you came through a break. We've all heard of railroad cuts from Gettysburg to a lot of Civil War battlefields, Resaca, Georgia, that have their own railroad cut. Well, Johnsonville is no exception. This is the railroad cut at Johnsonville coming into the depot. And as it entered the depot, the trains would enter on what was called a turntable. This is a model of a turntable, but the Johnsonville turntable is still intact. It's right there. You can kind of see the semicircle. Again, I'm sorry I can't point, but if you look at the middle of that photograph, you'll see a stone with some pig iron screws that held the arm. So let me go back. If you'll look at this big piece of rotating railroad track, an arm elevated that in the middle. So it would turn the trains back in the direction of Nashville, while a secondary train backed down the track, hooked up to the rail cars, and pulled the supply cars to the river warehouses where they were loaded up with supplies. But the railroad turntable, this is the only one that I know that still exists. I've searched across America. There is one in Ohio, but in Battlefield, Civil War, Tennessee, this is the only Civil War era turntable that I know that still exists. Okay. Excuse me, I had to get a drink of water. So now that you know a little bit more about what Johnsonville looked like, we're going to kind of rapidly move through this. As I mentioned once again in the beginning of the presentation, it's a very convoluted story. You've got civilians, you've got quartermasters, department employees, you've got naval employees, you've got Army, you've got everything you can think of inside this 90-acre perimeter known as Johnsonville. But the overall Union forces in Tennessee at that time, or the Union commanders in the West, you had Sherman, who's organizing. They're moving into Georgia. Major General George Thomas, of course, is headquartered at Nashville. These are the commanders. At Johnsonville itself was a young 23-year-old colonel named Charles Thompson, who was commander of the 12th United States Colored Troop Regiment. The The naval commander at Johnsonville was this man right here, acting volunteer Lieutenant Edward King. He was also the commander of his own flagship, the USS Key West. So you had two officers in charge at Johnsonville. So imagine how, as I mentioned before, how confusing and convoluted that must have been. Just through my research, I discovered that neither of these men liked each other. They actually hated each other's guts. Um, Neither one of them, as the battle unfolds and we learned about what happened, ever claimed that they were ordered to Johnsonville and never were ordered as to take charge of the post itself. So even though these men acted as senior officers in charge, both of them admitted that they were not in charge of the place at all. So you had this constant confusion of leadership going on the whole time. This made up the Johnsonville garrison, about 2,200 men. You can see that there was one substantially sized white regiment, the 43rd Wisconsin, a scattering of United States colored troops, Quartermaster Department employees, and then you had smaller groups that really came and went, that were never really stationed there, but they were there on November 4th when the battle unfolds. This is a gentleman from the 43rd Wisconsin. You can see, they're a late war regiment. They weren't recruited until August of 1864. They get 6 weeks of training. They're put on trains. They go to Nashville, and by mid-October, they arrive at Johnsonville. And this is Ralph Bushnell. I've met his ancestor who allowed me to use his wonderful photograph for my book. These are the officers of the 43rd Wisconsin taken right in at January of 1865 in Nashville, just after the Battle of Johnsonville. Keep in mind, to give you a scale of this, the Western Theater Tennessee campaign that you always hear about is always Franklin, then Nashville. What's left out of that equation is Johnsonville. So it really started in early November of 1864 with the Battle of Johnsonville, then Franklin, then Spring Hill, then Franklin, then Nashville. So you have this 4-battle campaign that makes up the late fall Tennessee campaign. Lorenzo Atwood, as you'll discover in my book, really fell into my lap and made what became my research. The story was my PhD dissertation that I turned into the book Johnsonville. And Lorenzo Atwood is just a remarkable figure. He was a corporal in the 43rd Wisconsin. Here you see him pictured with his son. He left a series of letters that I was very graciously fell upon through his ancestor visiting the park one day. And in these letters, he had written descriptions of the interior of Johnsonville. So even the ORs, no one had ever known anything about what the inside of Johnsonville looked like until these letters emerged. In those letters, he had some sketches. One of those is right here. This is just in extraordinary detail. Atwood described the interior of Johnsonville. If you can see there, you see it says picket line 5 miles long surrounding the depot. But what's amazing, that's something we never knew about, is the existence of 11 barracks buildings that were 30 feet wide by 90 feet long. And you see him picturing them here. In the letter, he tells his wife that, here I am, I'm with my bunkmate in number H, in letter H. But you also see numbers. Number 1, it says a battery of 6 guns. Number 2, a regiment of cavalry. And then number 3, it says Company B, our regiment on a high hill 100 rods. And what he's talking about there is either the upper or the lower redoubt that you saw earlier. But this is from an October 19th letter. The regiment arrived on October the 16th. So he's drawing this in his wife to his letter just 3 days after he arrives. Just a fantastic find for the research. While I was manager there, we took some of the descriptions that Atwood left to build for our living history demonstration area. 2 of the barracks buildings, we eventually built 4 of these based on his description. He said we constructed 9-by-9 quarters made of board and batten, with bunk beds on one side and masonry chimneys on the other, where we planned to winter uh, through the winter of 1864. So we took that description, we actually constructed these, and the park still uses it today for their living history program. I think it's really fantastic because we actually used a real world description by a soldier who was there to reconstruct the actual size of the barracks. Um, so that I mentioned before, there were USCT troops there. This is just an example of one. And this is another section of the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery that I showed you on the ramps earlier. You also had a very seasoned battery, a federal battery there, the 1st Kansas Battery, who was quite embattled. You can see their battle honors. They showed up in the summer, shortly after the depot opened in May, in July of 1864. And Theodore Gardner's letters, if those of you may be familiar with his letters, are quite famous, who was a member of the 1st Kansas Battery. He left some amazing descriptions of their time and life inside of Johnsonville. This, I've visited the Kansas Historical Society and was very pleased that the curators let me have a photograph of the actual flag. That flag would have been at Johnsonville. Unfortunately, they left the Johnsonville battle sequence off there, but they did include Nashville. The naval operations, you can see there were 4 10-clads, the USS Tarawa, the Key West, the Elfin, and the Undine. I think just through research, there was approximately about 400 sailors and officers with the U.S. Navy at Johnsonville. This is a profile of those 10-clad boats. And essentially excuse me, if you've researched Navy, a 10-clad is a transport boat with what we would, a comparable surface would be an aluminum can. It was basically that thin. You had a piece of tin that was riveted on the side of these paddle boat transports, and they were loaded with seacoast artillery, military, naval guns. Most of these were like 24-pound Dahlgren seacoast artillery that were put through ports that you see on the side of these boats, and they sit very low at the waterline. And this is what was converted as, basically civilian transportation for military use that would participate in the Battle of Johnsonville. So this was quite common. See, these are not the poop turtles. These are not the ironclads that you would have seen at the Battle of Fort Donelson. You have a significant naval battle that's about to unfold, being partaken by these 10-clads. And I'll tell you, if a picture doesn't speak 1,000 words, this is a really rare Western theater sailor that I found. A young kid from Mound City, Illinois. I believe that was 1862 or 3. So as we leave that now, we'll get into the Confederate West Tennessee Johnsonville expedition that really kicked off in late October, early October of 1864. Of course, the star of that show is Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who at that time is commander of those forces of his cavalry troops that become known as the West Tennessee Johnsonville Campaign. So just to follow me right here, on October 16th, Forrest is ordered by his commander, Lieutenant Richard Taylor, to make a foray into West Tennessee for harassing and destroying Union operations. So you see Forrest's orders directly out of the ORs right there. Sever General Sherman's communications, delay Thomas at Nashville from concentrating troops, and eventually try to assist John Bell Hood's advance into Middle Tennessee. So as Hood is moving north, Forrest takes his contingent and moves into West Tennessee as a feint move to draw attention away from Hood's advance. So his commanders, his division commanders are James Chalmers of his 1st Division. And in Chalmers' division, you have Colonel Thomas Mabry and Colonel Robert McCulloch. Also in Chalmers' division, you have the famous Colonel Edmund Rucker from Alabama. and Lieutenant Colonel David Kelly with the 7th Tennessee Cavalry. In charge of his 2nd Division was Brigadier General Abraham Buford. And with Buford is, of course, Brigadier General Highland Lyon and Colonel Tyree Bell. If you get a chance, a few years back, it's been about 10 years now, there's a fantastic book about Tyree Bell that I highly recommend. It goes into the Johnsonville campaign. Get your hands on that if you can. It's a great read. And of course, a big part of this story is Forrest's young but very effective Chief of Artillery, John W. Morton. Once again, a young man, 24 years old. He'll play a significant part of this story. So, and again, I'm going to speed up through this as quickly as I can, but Forrest's men eventually arrive at Jackson, Tennessee, where they meet Chalmers' division, who had been operating around Memphis. They all rally at Jackson, and they move north, heading toward Kentucky to try to secure recruits and mounts for their men, because a lot of Forrest's contingent are mounted infantry at this stage in the war. So you do have some foot infantry, but a majority of these men are serving as mounted infantry. So they move up north of Jackson into West Tennessee, and they come to a place called Paris Landing. And at Paris Landing, they basically leave some of Chalmers' division, some of Buford's division there, and take the other half and occupy this place called Fort Heiman, which is just over the Tennessee border in Kentucky. And they occupy Fort Heiman on October 28, 1864. This was originally a Confederate-built fort that had been basically abandoned for 2 years. Forrest had known about it. You know, he had participated in the Donelson campaign very early in the war, and had also been operating in Western Kentucky earlier in 1864 with Paducah and Union City. So he was quite familiar with this location. This is just a view of what that area looks like today at the Kentucky Lake. You see the bridge at the top. Fort Heiman would have been just north of there. So Forrest's men eventually commandeer 2 vessels that they used to attack Johnsonville. So keep in mind, initially, part of the plan was not attacking Johnsonville from the western shore. They were trying to gain these recruits and get supplies. Eventually, as these transport boats come through Fort Heiman on their way to Johnsonville, they capture these vessels in and around Paris Landing and Fort Heiman. They destroy 2 of these boats and capture the USS Undine, which was one of the 10-clad gunboats, and the transport boat called the Venus. Unfortunately, there's not a wartime photograph of the Undine, but there was one of its sister ship known as the USS Nymph, and this is it. This is number 54. So this is a pretty good idea of what the Undine looked like. And you can see the vessels that are seized by Forrest on the campaign on October 29th and 30th, the Mazeppa, the Venus. All these have supplies, so they capture these supplies. The Undine and then the J.W. Cheeseman. The Mazeppa is captured and it's burned 2 miles above Fort Henry on the 29th. And the Cheeseman is also a huge transport boat that's captured, and it's eventually burned as well at a place called White Oak Island, just off of the Big Sandy River that flows into the Tennessee River. The Venus and Undine are captured. Now, on these captured boats here, and if you can, and again, I'm sorry I don't have a way to point at images. All I can do is look at you in a camera, but I'm going to try to be very convincing here. So you have Forrest's troops that on November 1st, and he has about 3,400 men under his command between the 2 divisions. They rally at Paris Landing on November 1st, and in some of the worst weather ever experienced in the war, as Forrest later wrote in his memoirs, they begin a 40-mile advance south from Paris Landing with half of his contingent aboard these 2 boats, while the other half are trying to accompany them on the land side, on the western side of the river. So if you can picture that in your head, you've got Morton and a lot of Chalmers division pulling these guns through this god awful mud, cutting their way on roads, trying to get 40 miles down, making their way to Johnsonville. And I'll tell you this, today it's still watery terrain. It's bottomland. I've grown up in that region of Tennessee. I'm from that area. I've duck hunted down there. I've fished down there. I can tell you that is some of the worst mud that you will ever experience in your life. How in the world these Confederates were able to haul guns through that terrain and do what they did, I think is one of the most remarkable military achievements aside the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad as part of this campaign. Eventually, they make their way down to an island in the middle of the river called the Reynoldsburg Island. I mentioned that town previously. That was just about 2 miles north of Johnsonville on the eastern shore. Now, keep in mind, as if you're looking at this slide, you see there in the middle it says rebel batteries, rebel batteries. They were on that side of the river. There's a significant naval battle that takes place the day before the Battle of Johnsonville and the day of, on November 3rd and 4th. It's called the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island. This is where the Confederates lose control of both the Undine, which eventually gets burned, and they lose their prized Venus in this fight. It's a very hotly contested battle. There's over 1,000 rounds exchanged in this naval battle. So, you've heard about the Battle of Fort Donelson and the Iron Valentines that are fired on Valentine's Day on February 14th, 1862, and the naval battle that pursues there. This is a tremendous battle that unfolds outside of Reynoldsburg Island between King's, remember Edward King, the Union Naval Flotilla commander, between the USS Key West and the USS Tarawa. They eventually do not succeed in capturing the Undine. The Confederates end up burning her just about where you see the boat in that map where it says Key West. Right around that bend is where I think the Confederates burned the Undine. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But you can see right there where the Tennessee River narrows, that's called the chute. And all the naval boat pilots knew about this chute, and they had to get through there. And the Confederates did quite a shellacking on those Federal gunboats as they tried to make their way through there. This is a great photo. This shows the Key West on the left. This is taken just before the Battle of Johnsonville. So you can kind of see what that Union flotilla would have looked like. So they eventually make their way down to Johnsonville. I'm not going to go a whole lot into the story because I want to save that for you in the book. But on November the 4th, the Confederates place 5 artillery locations directly across the river from the depot, and they plant their artillery, camouflage it, digging chambers into a natural levee on that side of the river. And at exactly 2 p.m., after synchronizing their watches from these positions, Forrest gives the command to begin a bombardment of Johnsonville. And during this battle, and Forrest later writes about this, he says it was the most terrific artillery firing that I'd ever experienced in the war. And keep in mind, Forrest was at Shiloh being bombarded by the Lexington and Tyler that night. So he had been under naval artillery fire. And for him to explain in his correspondence after this battle that this was some of the most terrific firing I'd ever heard in the war, that says a lot, because right as the Confederates unleashed their fire, those gunboats at the wharf backed out into the river, enfilading the Confederates, bearing down upon them over 50 naval guns. I cannot imagine how this unfolded. So once that happens, the 2 forts on the hills begin firing as well at the Confederates. The Confederates are very well concealed. They managed to knock the steering out of most of the gunboats, most of the Federal tin-clads, sending them floating downriver. And then they began targeting the massive piles of supplies across the river docked at the wharf. Eventually, the battle just comes into just this incredible fiery sequence of guns that last over 2.5 hours. So it's basically an artillery battle that's taking place over a 300-yard wide river. So one of the reasons you don't hear so much about the Battle of Johnsonville is because of the casualties. The casualties are very low out of this. You know, the Confederates only lose 2 men out of this whole engagement, and the Union lose about 150 men, and that includes captured as well. This shows you a picture of some of the guns that would have been engaged there. There's Fort Johnson that I showed you earlier. This is what it looks like today. This is what Fort Johnson actually looks like, the upper redoubt, excuse me, the lower redoubt. Pure chaos. So from 2 to 5 p.m., those 5 concealed positions are very effective on basically knocking out warehouse number 1. It's set on fire, including all the stockpiled stores sitting on the wharf. What happens, and I'm not going to spoil the book for you, because in the middle of this is one of the most crazy things that happens throughout the entire Civil War. But the Union commanders pretty much lose their nerve and order Howland and a lot of the naval commanders to go on board these transport boats. And at the time of the battle, there's 26 transport boats at the wharf, and burn them. So the Confederates are across the river, yelling across the river. And keep in mind, this is election day too. This is when McClellan is going up against Lincoln in the national election, just like what we've experienced. And they're screaming at these naval sailors, these Union naval sailors, telling them not to burn these beautiful vessels. So the winds are up that day. The winds sweep across the wharf and eventually burn the entire place to the ground. It's really a disaster that it was really difficult for me to wrap my head around how this could happen. The Confederates that night, they hang out. Most of the Confederate forces withdraw down south back toward the town of Corinth, Mississippi. Forrest actually leaves behind a couple of batteries there. And at 7 a.m. the next morning, there's another tremendous artillery fight that takes place. A number of United States colored troops run to the shoreline and begin firing musketry back at the Confederates. And another battle breaks out. This tremendous firefight takes place once again on the 5th. So the last shots of the Battle of Johnsonville actually are fired not until the evening. So it's a 2-day battle, just like Shiloh, and a lot of these, some of the Western theater battles. But of course, the casualties are not as bad, but once again, because they're not fighting on open fields using these open line tactics. Now, this is a photograph that I took of the location of where some of these vessels that were sunk during the battle still sit today. In the foreground there, it's about 15 feet deep. That's the resting location of the USS Elephant and Ottawa and 2 other barges that were there. The state of Tennessee has done some dives on these boats. Johnsonville is also the only place in the United States Civil War site that has the largest collection of Civil War naval wrecks. So they're all together right here. And again, they're in about 15 to 20 feet of water. It's not like diving in the ocean. Diving in an inland river is very muddy. You can barely see your hand in front of your face. But they've used underwater magnetometers to outline the footprint of these boats. And there have been 4 underwater archaeological dives on these wrecks. And they've retrieved quite a few artifacts. The last dive was in 2010. And we have those artifacts in the museum at Johnsonville. Here's some of the losses out of the Battle of Johnsonville. You can see it was estimated over $6 million worth of damages were a result. 33 pieces of artillery, 4 gunboats, 17 transports. This is the report of Forrest. 2 men killed, 9 men wounded on the Confederate side. General John Schofield, who you'll know from the Battle of Franklin and other Western theater engagements, he shows up a day and a half later with 2 brigades of reinforcements to Johnsonville. They begin digging rifle pits and reinforcing the forts. So today, Unlike a lot of the national park battlefields like Fort Donelson and Fredericksburg, where in the 1930s you had the CCC come in and add dirt on top of Civil War earthworks, at Johnsonville, when you go there, you see the work that Schofield and his men did. And, we have an exact tie to Franklin because they stay there for 3 weeks until Thomas orders Schofield's division out of Johnsonville to go down and receive John Bell Hood's advance as he moves into Spring Hill, Tennessee. So before he goes to Spring Hill, Schofield is right there at Johnsonville with two of his brigades. There's the upper readout today. You can see just a beautiful, massive earthwork that's still intact. So on the 26th of November, as the battle of Spring Hill about 3 days later is about to unfold, and eventually on November 30th, General Thomas orders Johnsonville completely abandoned. So that means all of its stores, all of its machinery, its personnel are to be sent to Nashville. So the final train full of all the stores leaves just as the bloody Battle of Franklin is unfolding. So Schofield's men leave there and they're engaged at the Carter House. I mean, they're right in the vortex of hell. So you can imagine, digging earthworks at Johnsonville, and then just days later, you're receiving Confederates in one of the bloodiest engagements of the Western Theater. But anyway, this equipment arrives at Johnsonville, leaves Johnsonville and arrives at Nashville very late in the evening, just as reports of this bloody battle are coming in the same time. So the results of the Battle of Johnsonville, it's essentially a tactical victory for the Confederates, but it really didn't matter. If this would have happened a year before, it probably would have. But strategically, Forrest's victory had little effect against Sherman's massive war machine, which at this time is, about to really rapidly be moving through Georgia as he kicks off his famed march to the sea on February the 14th. 1/3 of Johnsonville Supply Depot was destroyed on November 4th and 5th during the battle. The aftermath, the Confederates' 2-week-long campaign not only resulted in the complete destruction of Johnsonville, but keep in mind, it also rendered the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad useless to the Union for the remainder of the war. The loss of the supply base essentially leaves Thomas and Nashville doubtful of the future use of the Tennessee River after they abandon the supply base there. And of course, in one of the famous responses that General Sherman makes because of Johnsonville is, quote, he said, as those rebels have destroyed our base of supplies, and he's talking about Johnsonville, they, meaning the rebel citizens, will furnish our subsistence. You will bear the brunt of the after effects. And y'all know the story from there, which is another story, is that Sherman then kicks off his famous march to the sea, I think because of the results of exactly Forrest. And one of the most famous quotes of the Civil War comes from the results of the Battle of Johnsonville, said by Sherman himself, quote, that devil Forrest, quote. And there was a continuation to that statement, which was, quote, that devil Forrest, ... was down and around Johnsonville wreaking havoc again on our gunboats, end of quote. So that's the continuation and the end of that story. And that's where I'm going to leave you tonight. This is my book. You can get this. There's through Savas Beatty. You can order it right there on their website. You see the link, or you can also call them at their number. They're offering actually a 20% discount through Christmas, maybe through the end of the year right now. So I'd certainly take advantage of that. It'll probably be going on even after Christmas. But use the code there, virtual, to receive your 20% discount. I've been overwhelmed by how well the book's been received. It's been doing very well on Amazon and with Savas Beatty and Barnes & Noble. So thank you very much. I hope you'll get a copy of the book and learn more about Johnsonville and the story that I shared with you tonight. And it's been a pleasure. I hope to be on with you again. And have a good night. Thank you very much.